Yeah, so now it says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook. So yeah, it says live on Facebook for me.
Okay, it says, okay, says we're there now. All right. Hi, everybody. I am Professor Rebecca Best of the UMKC Political Science Department. Welcome to our latest installment of Poli-Sci Quickbites. Today, we're talking about judicial reform with Professor Ben Woodson. Dr. Woodson teaches courses on constitutional law and researches judicial legitimacy and politicization of the court. Before we get started, I want to take a moment and thank all of you for joining us, and to also thank my colleagues, Professor Deborah Leiter, for organizing this series, and Professor Ben Woodson for joining us today for this.
And thank you, Professor Best, for asking some questions and joining us for this as well.
All right, thank you. So, Dr. Woodson, the Supreme Court of the United States is historically one of the most trusted institutions in American federal government. But in recent years, we've seen a lot of controversy around the Supreme Court. In 2015, the court weighed in on both gay marriage and the Affordable Care Act, attracting Republican ire. And between the Senate's refusal to consider the nomination of Merrick Garland and the controversial appointment of Neil Gorsuch, and even more controversial confirmation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Democratic confidence in the court has declined in recent years. Is the court in crisis, and is it overly politicized?
Well, I guess to answer that question in some ways, you need to separate out two different things. So there's the perception of the court and the reality of the court. So the reality of the court is that it's politicized. Judges make decisions in highly political ways. Their political attitudes influence their decisions. So for example, like original intent, this legal doctrine that whatever, lots of people, well, basically it's the most popular legal doctrine if you ask American people. And so a judge will say, like, I am using original intent to make this decision. But sort of the choice of using original intent is just a choice to make conservative decisions. There's no real difference. You just use different words to sort of justify it. Because if you use original intent, you're going to make conservative decisions. That's just sort of is how it's going to be. And so the reality of the situation is that the court is politicized and judges act in political ways, especially on the US Supreme Court. However, when we're talking about legitimacy of an institution, in reality, the reality doesn't really matter too much. It matters some because it affects perceptions, but perceptions are what is most important. And so while like courts are highly political, the perception of the court is that it's this legal institution. So we sort of have this perception of the court as a legal institution, but it's in reality a very political institution. So there's this like legal facade over the court, where we have a political court that's sort of hidden with legal mumbo jumbo, essentially. And so the legitimacy of the court in the American public, at least, is in some part built on this legal facade, this idea, this sort of basically just kind of fake legal glossing over a political court. And so if that legal facade sort of tumbles or falls away, then yes, the court will be in very big trouble. Because, and there is some evidence that it does appear to be kind of going that way. So the court is seen as more political than it seems to be seen as more political than it used to be. So if you ask people, like the majority of folks will call the court political, they'll call the appointment process too political. So it is seen as more political, which will start to sort of put chinks in that armor of the legal facade, which kind of protects the legitimacy of the court. And so it does really seem that we could be on the verge of a crisis in the court. However, it is kind of important to note that if you actually ask like the correct kind of legitimacy questions, as opposed to, you had mentioned confidence in the court, and I can't really get into the details of this one too much, but that's kind of it's not exactly legitimacy. It's easier to move around and stuff than actual legitimacy is. And if you actually measure sort of the perceived legitimacy of the court, which is like the idea of respecting the decisions of the court, that doesn't seem to have gone down quite as much as sort of the politicization of the court. And one of the reasons is we kind of treat the court in America as kind of like both political and legal in some ways. But what could happen, and what some of my research suggests could happen, is that the sort of being perceived as political could lead to like a spiraling kind of snowballing effect, where essentially if you see the court as political, you're going to be less likely to like their decisions, which will make you perceive the court as more political. The more political you see the court, it doesn't really matter what they do. You'll just dislike anything else that they do. And so sort of as these sort of build on each other and that legal facade starts to sort of tumble, we really could see in the sort of near future a lot more attacking the court, a lot more trying to do things like pack the court or reduce the powers of the court and these sorts of things. So it is somewhat troubling where we sort of are now, but it's important to note and put this in sort of historical context because our modern conception of the court, and we sort of think of it as like there's this big crisis, everyone is mad at the court and sort of that sort of thing. But our modern conception of the court as this powerful, non-political branch of government that bosses the other branches of government around is a relatively new phenomenon. So like, even though the court is somewhat in a crisis these days, it's still more powerful than it used to be. So back like before the Civil War, essentially if the court made a decision the president didn't like, there was a very good chance the president would just be like, nah, I'm not going to do that. We're going to ignore you. People didn't actually believe in the idea of judicial review really to some degree. And so whenever you're thinking about sort of the court being in crisis, you need to think of it sort of relatively because of just, it's been much, much, much worse in the past. And our current conception of the court as this non-political, very powerful institution is basically like a post-World War II thing. For the most part, definitely post-Civil War thing. And so it is in crisis, but it's been in crisis many, many other times before and sort of has survived. So it probably won't like go away or anything like that, but it could sort of just lead to more attacking of the court and things like that. All right, so yeah, that's so yeah, we probably are in a bit of a crisis, but you know, historically speaking, it's maybe not as worse as it's been in the past because of just how our politics has changed over time.
Okay. So I have some follow-up questions for you. So you said the court is relative to recent history in a little bit of a crisis, but over the longer term of the history of the country, the court is sort of has more authority, more influence now than it did in the early part of our country's history. So in that sort of current context of increasing perceptions of politicization, but also concerns about legitimacy, who can, well, assuming that we want to change that perception and go back to what we saw early, some years back, who can save the court? Who can sort of reverse that process? Is this something we have to trust to the justices themselves? Is this something that Congress can do? And if so, how?
Well, trusting the justices themselves isn't going to work because that's essentially the system we have now. Our sort of legal system is we're going to put 9 people, well, the Supreme Court part of it. We're going to put 9 folks on the Supreme Court. We're going to give them that job for life and just assume that they're going to be good people that interpret the law. If they don't, well, there's nothing we can do about it and they can do whatever they want. And if they want to become super partisan politicians, essentially, they can do that on the court and there's nothing really we can do. And so like basically trusting the justices to do what is right is what we do right now. Even if though the justices do what is right, which is just interpret the law to the best of their ability, because of things like partisan biases and motivated reasoning, they can't. Like their political attitudes, even if they're trying to not do that, will influence their decision making. Because not every single legal argument comes down to some value judgment, but a lot of them do. It just comes down to sort of, do you like security or do you like liberty more? And you sort of weigh it, and ideology affects that. And that's also how legal decisions are made. And so trusting the justices isn't really going to work probably. And so, all right, so trusting the justice, is it probably going to work? And so I guess Congress is kind of the one that can do it to some degree. But before we sort of get into that, sort of when you're thinking about judicial reform, one of the sort of key factors is kind of this tension between independence and accountability. So courts are supposed to be independent. They're supposed to make non-political decisions, and we make them independent by giving them very, very lifetime terms. And so independence is good, because if you're independent, then the other branches of government won't influence you, and the public won't influence you either. And so that makes you able to protect the rights of minorities. That's great. However, it also means that, once you're on the court, you can basically act as a dictator and do whatever you want. And if you want to just change the Constitution willy-nilly, within reason, you can sort of do that. And so it violates sort of this idea of democratic accountability. And so one way to reform the court is to make it more accountable, move towards something like elected courts, not exactly like that. But the problem with moving towards elected courts or an accountable court is, if a court's accountable, then, well, how are you going to protect the rights of the minority groups? Because everything's just going to be majority rule. And so courts won't do that if they're accountable. And so essentially every single judicial reform that you pretty much ever do will have some problem, because either it makes it more independent, which is good in some, but bad in other ways, or it makes it more accountable, which is good in some ways and bad in other ways. And so you sort of have to just choose which bad thing you want, because there's no perfect way to reform courts or to structure courts, because in the end, it always relies on sort of just trusting individuals to some degree. And if you do that, that's never going to work all the time. And so you have this kind of tension between independence and accountability. And then also you need to go back to this idea of sort of the legal facade, because when we're thinking of sort of ways to reform the court, at least in my head, how I think about it is that there's two sort of options. You can just go all in on the legal facade and try to just reinforce this kind of myth of the court, that this myth of the court as being legalistic, and sort of go all in on that. Just be like, all right, we're going to make the court appear legal. We're going to try to make it actually legal, and try to just reinforce this kind of myth of the court. So make it try to make it legalistic. So that's sort of what Mayor Pete's plan was. He had this plan where he had he wanted to expand the court to 15 and have 10 justices then choose the other 5 judges on a rotating schedule for 1-year terms, which was the idea, was to make the court less political and to sort of reinforce this idea of the court as a legalistic institution. I think those will sort of inevitably fail, just because judges are inevitably going to be political, and it's inevitably going to be politicized in some way. And so the other option is that you sort of accept reality. You accept the reality that the court's going to be somewhat political, and you sort of just change how we think about the court. Change how one way I put it is reorient the legitimacy of the court. So the legitimacy of the court is now based on this idea, for the most part, of it being legalistic. Well, you can just turn the court into a representative institution. Now, I put that wrong. We can just recognize the fact that the court is already a representative institution. That is just what it is. It cycles really, 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 really slowly, sort of like the difference between the House and the Senate. The Senate cycles its representation slowly, so from 2 to 6-year terms. The United States Supreme Court also cycles its representation slowly. It's just based on the sort of how long a person lives. So it's based on however old Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, how long she can keep living. That is what the ideology of the US Supreme Court is based on. If she makes it until Trump's out, then the court will move more liberal. If she doesn't, then the court will move more conservative. And that seems absurd, for that to sort of be what determines the ideology of the court, the health of elderly, the health of people. And so we already sort of have kind of representation in the court that slowly turns. It just slowly turns based on when justices choose to retire or happen to die. And so one way that you can sort of protect the legitimacy of the court is by changing it to sort of legitimacy based on electoral accountability. So talking about the court as a representative institution, and treating it sort of how it actually is. And so this could, no one's really, like, this is sort of something I'm doing research on in the next 5-ish years or so. But sort of you can think of there's this doctrine called popular constitutionalism, which is the idea that this is a bit simplistic, but the idea that the Constitution means basically whatever the American people want it to be. If the American people want abortion protected by the Constitution, then it is. If they don't, then it's not. So it's just based on sort of public opinion. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. And so while I've only done sort of convenient sample stuff of this, there is some evidence that, based on some national samples, that a large component of the population believes in popular constitutionalism, likes the idea of the Constitution just meaning whatever the American people want it to mean. And so even though like politicians don't really talk about the court in that way or talk about our legal system in that way, the American people seem primed to at least accept it, or at least some of them would be primed to accept it. And so one other option, which is just the one that I think is probably the most, maybe it's not, it requires a constitutional amendment, which is hard, but it's the least offensive to sort of both sides of the political spectrum, is one thing you could do to sort of maybe make the court a bit better is to just move to 18-year term limits. So, you know, that's not a huge change. The court still has sort of, it still acts as like a legalistic institution. The judges are still pretty independent because they just serve for one 18-year term. But it sort of would perhaps reinforce this idea of the court as kind of this representative institution, where just instead of the membership cycling every 6 years like the Senate does, it just cycles every 18 years. So it's just very, very, very slow. So there's this famous quote from, which one was it? George, well, I don't know if he actually said it, but a quote that is commonly attributed to George Washington, I believe. It's the one about like the, you know, in the Senate, you pour the tea into the saucer and the saucer like cools the tea because the Senate's supposed to cool the sudden breeze of passions that flow through the House. And so this is sort of one way you can think of a representative type of court with 18-year term limits. It's just a much, much bigger saucer that kind of cools passions much, 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 much greater, because that was sort of one of the justifications for the longer term limits in the Senate. And so this could solve a few problems. So for example, it solves the problem of the ideology of the court being determined by the random health of its members, which seems, again, absurd for that to occur. Also, what would happen is sort of every 2 years, a president would get a Supreme Court appointment. So, you know, if you serve 2 terms as a president, you replace half the Supreme Court. So, you know, you still have a lot of influence, but it's more regularized. And one of the big problems with the Supreme Court appointment process is that the Supreme Court appointments are just too important right now. Like, they're so important that Mitch McConnell is going to make up some nonsensical precedent to prevent Merrick Garland from getting nominated because, you know, he's willing to look like a fool and everybody knows what he's saying is completely foolish. And he'll just say it because, well, he needs a Supreme Court appointment and it's that important that they're willing to essentially cheat. Well, both sides would really be willing to cheat on that one. And so it lessens somewhat, at least, the importance of Supreme Court appointments. You could do other things like just lessen the power of the Supreme Court a bit. So if you lessen some of the stuff the Supreme Court's able to do, that makes these appointments less important. And if they're less important, then people are going to be less likely to sort of do the Merrick Garland thing and sort of treat it more as a legalistic institution. And so like these 18-year terms would sort of balance independence and representation to some degree. Because since you have 18-year terms, those judges are still independent in the exact same way that the current Supreme Court justices are. Because no judge is going to serve 2 18-year terms. Like, no one's getting appointed to the Supreme Court before they're the age of 50. And you're not going to get appointed twice at, what would that be, 60? Well, you're not going to get appointed twice to that. So basically, you have your one term. You can make whatever decisions you want. You're not going to be punished for anything that you say or do, except for being yelled at on Twitter. But you still have that somewhat degree of indirect representation, which perhaps will, if politicians start to talk about the court in a popular constitutionalism type way, could sort of provide an alternative basis for the legitimacy of the court if that legal facade, which seems to be crumbling, actually crumbles down, which would then prevent the court from having legitimacy.
All right. So it sounds like there are some different possibilities for ways to address these issues, but most of them seem to come with some potential drawbacks as well. So you're suggesting that perhaps the one that has the biggest upside relative to any drawbacks would be to implement 18-year term limits on Supreme Court justices. So I'm wondering, unlike the general public, most political scientists oppose term limits for Congress, or seem to oppose term limits for Congress and for legislators. So can you tell us what makes term limits for judges and justices different from term limits for legislators, or are they different?
Well, I'm going to borrow something from that we talked about earlier from your email, which is that so every political scientist in the world knows that legislative term limits are absolutely horrible ideas that should never be implemented, and they're bad and should just go away. And the basic reason, correct me if I get this sort of slightly off, but I'm pretty sure the basic reason is just because, when legislators are first getting into Congress or the state legislature or whatever, they have no idea what they're doing. They are amateurs and they're just sort of going along with their party, or they're going along with their handlers or whatever, for the most part. And so if we have term limits, once they actually figure out how to be a legislator and know what they're doing, they have to leave. And so when this happens, the only people that know what they're doing are like party insiders or lobbyists or things like that. And so that gives these folks more experience and more power because they're the only ones that know what they're doing. And so it can be bad for those reasons by giving lobbyists more influence. So for judicial term limits, that's not going to be a problem because judges aren't really, there's no lobbyists that try, well, I guess you could call the people who are arguing in front of them sort of lobbyists, but they're not really like lobbyists. So there's no lobbyists really trying to influence them. Once, especially if we're talking about the US Supreme Court, once you've made it to the US Supreme Court, you're already an expert in the law. So there's no sort of, that downside isn't there. And in some ways, that is sort of so the purposes of why people like legislative term limits don't really apply to judges. And these judicial term limits are long enough anyway that, we shouldn't have 80-year-olds. I guess I can't say that with the current president's candidates, but I was going to say we shouldn't have sort of like people who would have retired in normal life a long time ago being on the US Supreme Court. And the only reason they're there is because if they leave, like Ruth Bader, like if they leave, then the ideology of the court will change. And so they just stick around as long as humanly possible, even if they don't want to. And so the judicial term limits can sort of stop that in some degree. And also since they're 18 years long, sort of it's not quite the same thing as like a 6-year term limit for a legislator. So I guess, yeah.
All right, makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit on our conversation to something that I don't know about everybody else watching, but I've seen mentioned in social media recently, but also in op-eds in places like the Washington Post. So in 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously tried to pack the court, adding up to 6 additional justices based on the age and tenure of the sitting justices. Sort of this similar idea that, they need to they need to go ahead and retire faster, and if they don't, he's just going to get to appoint more. So FDR was seeking court approval for the for New Deal legislation that was designed to pull the country out of the Great Depression. He was ultimately able to get Supreme Court support without packing the court, in part because of this sort of implicit threat that he might try to. But we find ourselves on the brink of something that some economists are saying could develop into a depression at a time when we've seen, even before the coronavirus crisis, we've seen prominent calls for Democrats to pack the court in 2021 in response, in part, to the refusal to consider Merrick Garland and the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation fight. Should we expect to see court packing in 2021 if Biden wins?
I would say probably not. So you're always going to hear people call for it on like the liberal side of the party, like that's going to be happening for the next, whenever a Democrat's in control of stuff. But I don't really expect the Democrats to actually do that for the reason that the main reason is just they don't need to. You only pack the court if you need to. And so FDR tried to pack the court in 1937 because for the, 5 years before that, I think it's 5 years, he, like the Supreme Court just struck down every major legislation, maybe not every, but for almost every major legislation he tried to pass. Like it was like anything that regulated the economy, the Supreme Court was like unconstitutional for whatever reason. They came up with some reason to declare it unconstitutional because the court at that time just hated all economic regulation. And so he tried to pack the court because they were holding up his agenda. Today, I don't expect that to happen because I don't expect the Supreme Court to actually hold up much of the Democrats' agenda. Because essentially, if the Democrats have enough power to pack the court, they have enough power to pass whatever they want to pass anyway over the Supreme Court's, then the Supreme Court wouldn't stop them. However, it's somewhat important to actually go look at history again when answering this question, because historically speaking, packing the court, well, I shouldn't say, it's not necessarily packing the court, manipulating the rules of the court to make sure that the court agrees with you ideologically is the normal thing to do. Not doing it is the abnormal thing to do. So, in American history, we've had sort of electoral realignments. To simplify it a little bit, basically like politics is relatively stable for 30 years, like the balance of power between the parties are the same. The parties sort of represent the same type of interests. And then something big happens. There's an electoral realignment and like one party dominates for the next 30 years or something like that. So basically every single time in American history, when we had some party that was in power, it lost power, a new party came in power. That new party that comes in power always tries to mess around with the court to make it agree with them. So the first party we ever had was the Federalist Party. In 1800, they lost power and were never going to get power again. Their final act in office was to pack the court with as many judges as they can because they knew that, hey, we're never going to be in power, but these judges will be there for the next 30 years, so at least we'll have the courts. So the Jacksonian Democrats, they take over in the 1830s or so. They pack the courts, rearrange the circuits of the court, which is basically just a way to manipulate the court to make sure that the court was going to be pro-slavery on their side. Republicans take over during the Civil War. They add and subtract members of the court, like I think at least 2 or 3 times, based on I like this president, we'll add to the court. I don't like that president. Let's just get rid of. Let's take a few people down so that he can't appoint anyone. And so essentially, and then in 1932, FDR takes over and he tries to do it and he fails. But in the end, it didn't really matter because after 1937, even though the court packing plan failed, FDR was able to do whatever he wanted because post 1937, the US Supreme Court didn't declare, basically the US Supreme Court just didn't really care too much about the idea of enumerated powers anymore and would let the US Supreme Court kind of do it, let the federal government pass whatever laws they want. And so he won. He didn't need to pack the court because the court sort of changed. And so essentially every time up until then that there was the chance to pack the court, they did. And so like the next kind of big realignment is kind of like the 70s to the 90s, Republicans gaining power. And they would have probably tried to pack the court. They just didn't have control of Congress, so they couldn't. And so now we've reached sort of 2020, where we're probably going through another electoral realignment. And there's at least some chance that sort of the Democrats dominate national politics for the next 10 to 20-ish years. Maybe it doesn't happen, but it's quite the possibility. And the Democrats, though, would only pack the court if they need to. And so if the Democrats have the ability to pack the court, that means they have control of the House, filibuster proof in the Senate, and the presidency. If they have all of those three things, they can pass whatever law they want. And most of the at least current agenda items for Democrats are not going to be prevented by the court. Like climate change legislation, that's going to be fine. At least the public, well, any health, like even Medicare for all is clearly constitutional. Paid family leave, something like that, increasing the minimum wage. All of these things are clearly constitutional, things the federal government can do, and things that even the current conservative Supreme Court isn't going to declare unconstitutional. And so while there are sort of the chance that like the court will kind of chop away at some rights, so like I don't expect John Roberts to overturn Roe v. Wade, but maybe like they will limit abortion rights a little bit. And like those little laws that are kind of fake laws designed just to make abortion harder, he'll allow more of those or something like that. So like you will have slight decreases maybe in some civil rights and civil liberties stuff. But that's probably not going to be enough to cause people to pack the court. And also, if the Democrats do sort of become the dominant power for the next 10, 20 years, Hardy for the next foreseeable future, John Roberts seems to be a Supreme Court justice that doesn't, that sort of kind of doesn't really use popular constitutionalism, but he has said that he wants to sort of protect the legitimacy of the court. And so he's not going to go off on a limb and sort of be like, well, the country just clearly, elected this liberal coalition with massive wins, and I'm just going to take the court and be super conservative and go against that. Like he's not going to do that because he knows that if he does that, then it will lead to things like packing the court, which will reduce the legitimacy of his institution and therefore reduce his power and his influence. And he doesn't want that to happen because he most likely also just doesn't want it to happen because he likes the idea of the US Supreme Court. So just because of the reason that if the Democrats have the ability to pack the court, they don't need to pack the court because they can already do whatever they want anyway. So I guess a good example of this is anti-discrimination statutes. So there's some case going before the Supreme Court, I think this year or next year, where they have the possibility of saying essentially that discrimination based on sexual orientation is illegal. They're not going to probably, but they have the possibility of doing that. And so when they don't do that, people get really, really, really angry. But like that isn't something you pack the court over, because rather than packing the court, all you need to do is just have Congress pass a law and it fixes the problem. And so you don't need to pack the court because you can already do what you want to do if you have the ability to pack the court. So I don't, unless, I may be missing some issue here where like there's something they can do that will lead to sort of horribly negative consequences that I'm not thinking of, but I don't really think that there's something out there that I'm sort of major thing I'm missing. Do you know of anything I might be missing?
I don't. That sounds reasonable to me, that if you have the ability to pack the court, you don't need to, and not just because you could already pass the legislation you want, but it seems like the fact that you could pack the court could potentially be enough of a deterrent to justices who are interested in the legitimacy of the court.
And also, I just forgot that Clarence Thomas probably won't make it 10 years. So if you get two terms of a Democratic president, you're going to replace a conservative with a liberal, and you got a 5-4 liberal majority anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. So also, if you just wait, eventually it becomes liberal. So that's the other reason. Like that's what happened in 1937, is they just waited long enough, and eventually people retired, and so the court turned liberal. And that's sort of the. I'll just tie this back to this idea of the court as a representative institution. While it moves in a slower cycle, eventually the court comes around to the dominant political coalition. It just takes a long time. So
we have a question from one of our viewers who mentions that there are some arguments out there that the GOP is better at gaming the Supreme Court system by nominating younger justices who can stay on the bench longer. We've also seen this mentioned with regard to the lower level judges, circuit court judges who've been appointed by the Trump administration. And not only are they apparently reportedly younger than sort of the average, but also the White House says that that President Trump has appointed, quote, a historic number of judges. And the Washington Post reported in December that 1 in 4 circuit court judges is now a Trump appointee. Do you think, so our questioner asks if you think there is a way to address partisan disparities in this arena absent term limits, and is that something that that you think the government would want to address, that Congress, for example, would want to address?
Well, let's see here. So there's not, I don't think there's a way that, well, there's one way Congress can, well, how to put this? There's one way Congress can address sort of the problem of, because the reason that Trump was able to nominate so many people was because essentially when Obama was president, McConnell just refused to approve judges. So like he sort of with Merrick Garland, he just did it en masse with lower court judges. And so while I don't think that necessarily will be sort of a huge problem for the legitimacy of the court, just because people don't really pay attention to that stuff, it is sort of part of an overall kind of trend in which it's kind of this tit for tat thing. So like it started with kind of Bork in the 80s, where Bork didn't get approved because he was too conservative. And so that made conservatives mad. And so then they sort of upped their ante a little bit. And I think this kind of answers the one question about sort of getting rid of that partisan disparity, where sort of what has happened is Democrats did that initially. Then the Republicans responded with upping the ante with their sort of hardball tactics on appointments and Supreme Court stuff. And so then the Democrats up their ante, then the Republicans up their ante, then the Democrats. And so it goes back and forth. And we've reached the point where we are today, where essentially, you use whatever tactics humanly possible to prevent court nominees and to get as many people on your court. So Republicans will basically refuse to vote for any Democratic nominees, especially at the US Supreme Court. Democrats refuse to vote for Republican nominees. And so I think that's where a lot of the kind of uptick in tactics has happened, or upticks in political tactics of sort of hardball sort of stuff has come from. And so that if that continues, that behavior could lead to some loss of legitimacy as it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. But like just people don't pay enough attention to lower court judges for that type of stuff to really matter too much. Like it's just something that, hardcore political activist types pay attention to, and they already know what they think. And so it's not really going to affect their attitudes too much. But it could leak over into kind of just the political rhetoric that people use. And also in some ways, this sort of emphasis to appoint these really, really, really young justices, just because you want them to stay on the court for a very, very long time because they won't, die for 50 years or whatever. Like that probably does lead to maybe worse judges, more political judges, because the judges are explicitly picked like, all right, you're young and conservative. That's all that matters. I don't care about anything else. And so there's been multiple judges that Trump has nominated. Like, I don't remember the details and I didn't really, but essentially it was just like stories about how they are completely and utterly unqualified to be judges. And they're still chosen because they are consistently conservative and they are younger. And so this actually is a problem that Republicans had in the past. During the 70s and 80s, they kept trying to nominate conservatives to the Supreme Court and to the other courts, I imagine, as well. They just kept messing up and accidentally nominating liberals or moderates. And so that could be one of the reasons why they're a bit more stringent on this court stuff than Democrats seem to be, is because they failed so much in the past that they're just more like, we must have hardcore conservatives and only hardcore conservatives. And also just that Republicans kept losing in the Supreme Court from like the 50s till the 80s on issues that were important to them. And so they got really, really, really angry at the Supreme Court and decided that they really needed to change it. And so they had a bit more of a coherent political movement to sort of shift the Supreme Court because it was already liberal. And so they needed to turn to conservatives. And so liberals kind of got a little complacent about the Supreme Court for a while. And so now we'll probably, I shouldn't say we, liberals, will probably be the ones that will get all angry about the Supreme Court and then sort of reverse that trend a little bit as their hardball tactics start to increase a bit more.
All right, interesting. Thank you. So I want to, before we wrap up, I want to ask you if there's anything that we haven't covered that we should cover that you can think of.
Let's see, is there any, well, I guess I'll just let's try to think of other sort of potential reform ideas. So one of the things is we could just sort of do elected courts. So, my whole spiel was that I thought we needed to turn the court into a representative institution. So what option is just, all right, let's go full bore. Let's elect Supreme Court justices. That sounds a little strange, but judges are elected in a lot of states. We could also do like maybe the retention election or something like that, but sort of, there are other ways to do this. So you could do elected, you could do Mayor Pete's plan. Like Mayor Pete's plan may do something, like it probably would help with, I don't know, it's just so complicated. That one could go really awry. But maybe it helps because it sort of helps with this veneer of legalism that the court is sort of survives on. So there are other things you could do, I guess. And so those are, I can't really think of anything else off the top of my head, but I don't know. So just, there's some other options out there. This isn't the only one. This is just sort of one option of a way to perhaps just kind of put the legitimacy of the court on a firmer footing because the legal facade does seem to be sort of crumbling a bit. So we got to do something.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who tuned in on Facebook to join us. And we will see you for the next episode of Poli Sci Quick Bites next week. Thanks.
Bye, guys.